what is a small press? I mean,
Oh
I know
gosh.
there's lots of people that, they're going to give you differing definitions.
Oh, that's what you mean by term. I thought you were talking about payment terms.
Oh, that too.
You meant terminology. That's a whole different episode, Jane. Hold your thoughts on that.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
This week, we welcome back very special guest, Jane Friedman of The Hot Sheet, to talk about, it's like an Orwellian obfuscation of meaning a lot of times when you operate in the publishing industry and you're like, it sounds like that means the opposite of what it's saying.
So small press is such a tortured term when I speak with authors. Each author uses it in a different way. Sometimes it's used as a derogatory term, which I find very frustrating. Sometimes it's used if you're a more literary author, like coming from an MFA background. It has a halo around it because they're considered the people who take risks on work that the really big publishers won't. There are some authors who are so let's say uneducated about the publishing industry that they use small press to refer to publishers you pay to get your book out. So it's such a mixed bag when I look at the author space. And so when I'm thinking of it, though, like if I'm talking with you or if I'm at some sort of industry event with booksellers and editors and agents, I generally think about small presses as people who operate outside of the conglomerate industry, mainly based in New York, who often struggle to stay in business because of problems with distribution, the very low profit margin, and kind of like this hand-to-mouth existence until they can get, say, a profitable backlist to help alleviate the risk of publishing new titles. So when I think about small press, that's generally who I'm thinking of. And then there are standout small presses that do have like a stronger financial footing for various reasons that usually have to do with them ignoring conventional wisdom about how books get sold, which I think describes Microcosm.
I feel called out.
Ooh, yes, my ears are burning. We made friends with Adventure Keen a few months ago. Do you know them?
I do.
Yeah. And it was like meeting your long lost sibling, where you're like, you do that thing too. And then it was like through and through, we were just like, specialty stores. I mean, why even bother with anybody else?
Yeah.
Right. But then when you fill them all up, you have these trade accounts too. It's great. But so, and this, I mean, Joe Matthews at IPG jokes that since Microcosm does every single thing wrong, it works. Which I'm still unclear if he meant that disparagingly or not, but he has repeatedly told people not to take my advice when I tell it to his publishers.
Wow.
So, but moving on to more pleasant topics, us Joes, we are a tight-knit team. But so what would you look for if you were an author looking at a small press, or if you were a small press looking to build a reputation?
I'd want to look first at their mission. What has motivated these people or an individual to do something that is this challenging? Or at least I find it exceptionally challenging.
Yeah.
It's not typically something you go in thinking I'm going to make lots and lots of profits. There's like a deep why sitting there. And so I'm always looking for what is that, and does it seem to have some business knowledge behind it as well? Some idea, for instance, of like, who is it you're trying to reach? What is this readership you have in mind? Is it this very kind of nebulous, I publish great literature for educated readers, which that's problematic on lots of different levels. But it is why I see so many different types of publishing operations start, more often in a literary journal space or online publishing great literature. And that's not a mission. And so if I'm an author looking for a small press, I want to find one that is making some really specific decisions about curation, about what books are worth the time, what fits the mission, and then thinking about how do those books get to market, and not just kind of this hopeful method of if only enough bookstores will take it, or only if we can get a New York Times review, or some of these things that don't necessarily sell books. So not the Hail Mary sorts of efforts, which frankly describes a lot of small presses. And I say that with love in my heart. Like it's not that I, think their efforts are negative. It's just that it's not necessarily going to be helpful for an author to, after their book comes out, realize that nobody knows this book exists except themselves, their circle of friends, and then their publisher.
Right.
What about for these small presses? Like, what if someone listening to this, say, was the publisher of a small press, either just starting out or just starting to figure out, oh, what I'm doing isn't working? Like, what advice would you give to them in like embracing the smallness but making it work?
I mean, I usually urge small publishers to think about their direct-to-consumer reach.
Yeah.
But as soon as you get very tactical with that, like for instance, if I said, oh, you need to have a really strong email newsletter that's reaching your readers, you have to take a few steps back and think about how are you going to get those people on your list? How are you going to reach those people? Are you going to do it through events? Do you already have some presence in this community? Are you going to try and secure some media in specific places that reach your community, et cetera, et cetera? So I'll use an example because it's kind of hard to talk about without a concrete example. There's a small press here where I live in Cincinnati. Well, they're across the river in Kentucky. They're called Lost Art Press. And I know them really well because they're my former colleagues. We used to work together at this mid-sized publisher in Cincinnati. And they have really deep knowledge of woodworking. They worked on a magazine, they did some books, but it's not really the books that matter as much as they understand this community so well. And if you ask them who are the experts or where do these people go for information or how do they buy their books or at what price point do they buy, they know exactly how these people think. They're in their heads. And so everything they do is suited to pleasing those people, not because they're trying to ingratiate themselves, but they know what these people want inside out. And so they already knew exactly the tool makers or the manufacturers they might partner with or the exact retail outlets that they would want to deal with. And obviously they had a foothold from being in that community for so long when they launched their press. But they had the partners. And I would say it's really hard to go into this without knowing the community you're trying to reach and the stakeholders or the people who are going to have some investment and they'll want to see you succeed.
Right. Thank you. And that's a fantastic example. I mean, that's like, because it couldn't be clearer. It's not a kind of book people think of often.
Right.
And I do have one of my closest friends. She texts me screenshots of publishers' mission statements all day long that are particularly esoteric, or when you like try to suss out meaning from it, you have more questions than answers,
right?
Or it's not a sentence, or and so I'm really glad that you took aim at that, because that does kind of tell you everything. That you're like, are they saying something? Like, do they stand for something?
Right.
And I almost, I think, and maybe slightly scandalous to say it, but I think that's kind of more important than somebody's distribution setup.
Oh, yes.
It really like focuses them like a laser versus like, and this is the conversation I have with publishers just about every day, is that I'm like, if you're in every store and your development is wrong, you're going to get a hefty bill.
Yeah.
And that's all you're going to see for it, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you took aim there rather than saying like, oh, see, make sure they're sold by PGW or PRHPS or whatever, you know? So, okay. And what else makes a strong small press? You can use your woodworker example if it helps.
I mean, on a big picture level, I think I've covered it. So then you get into like more operational things and like business know-how, and how is it that you're where are you going to plant your flag, and what difficulties might that pose for you? So like, for instance, you guys don't deal with Amazon. That's definitely planting a flag, and it might make things difficult for you in some ways, but they're untold benefits. It does not make things difficult. Only when the author's mother wants to buy a book. That's all. That's
it's there. Some third party is selling it to her. It's great.
Hopefully, not with every small press.
Right. I mean,
yeah. So I mean, I think it's about knowing what to say no to, because it doesn't fit your strengths, or it doesn't fit your community, or it doesn't fit who you're trying to reach. There's so much status seeking, doing what's prestigious, or chasing things because this is what you do in publishing. Like, you want these certain reviews or these certain people to pay attention, and it's ultimately a distraction. So it's always impressive to me when someone like Microcosm or Lost Art Press, and there's some others I could name, where they're like, you know what, we don't really need to be in bookstores in this particular way. We'd rather sell direct, or we'd rather sell right off of our website, or we'd like, this happens with self-publishing authors too. You know, there's, I would say 70 to 80% of them at the beginning are like, oh, I want my book in my local bookstore, and I want to see it in Barnes and Noble. And of course, traditionally published authors are always being offended that Barnes and Noble isn't carrying 2 copies of their book in every store nationwide. And I'm like, this isn't going to move the needle for you. This isn't what's keeping you from success, right? You realize this, don't you? This is just a status marker that makes you feel good. And I think that's what gets in the way of so many small presses. I mean, some of them do kind of stumble into greatness, and but that's not a business model. Like, I can't tell small presses, maybe by accident you will win a huge book award and then you'll have it made. That's just, you're waiting for the lightning strike, and I feel like that's what a lot of presses are doing.
So one thing I hear a lot from authors, our own and others, is that they feel like by working with a small press instead of like Penguin Random House or whatever, that they know that they are signing up to basically what they say is have to do my own marketing and publicity. Like that's the conception, is that they're just going to have to do a lot more of what they see as what should be the publisher's work. I have a lot of thoughts about this assumption, but I would love to know.
Look, we're here to hear yours.
We're here to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing can be said of the biggest publishers. They offer support in a very specific way, which is they have the sales and distribution that's pretty strong. And if you do get your 2 books in Barnes and Noble, you know, they can make it happen. But so what? It doesn't often matter that much, and they're not actually giving you personalized attention or coming up with anything other than their boilerplate. Yeah, we'll send your books to the same list we send 5,000 other books to, and it doesn't do anything. So I actually think small presses, when you, if the small press is checking the box of the mission and everything that we've talked about, they're going to be fabulous at marketing and promoting your book. That's not to say that you should just, you know, sit on your hands and wait for them to do everything. But if they know the communities they're reaching and they have direct to consumer reach, that is like more than half the battle. And then you need to show up and then bring your own resources or connections or time and energy to boosting that signal and making sure that the publisher's reach is going to its furthest extent possible. So, and I speak as someone who worked at an enthusiast publishing company where I saw the power of this. We basically didn't have a marketing department, but it didn't mean we didn't do marketing. We had 1 publicist for 1,000 titles, which was silly. We shouldn't have even had the one. But we had book clubs, we had magazines, we had 1 million email addresses. We had events. We had online education. And so the books sold themselves because we knew what to publish and we could reach the end reader without putting a single book in stores or advertising or getting reviews or any of that.
Sounds like marketing to me.
Well, yes, it's just that authors don't look at it and think, oh, that's marketing. They think marketing is a New York Times ad.
Well, any final words of wisdom about small presses before we move on?
Something very practical for authors. Please read the contract. Just read it. You have to read it. You have to read it and you have to understand it. And that's not because I think the publisher is going to try to pull one on you, but I think a lot of people have very strange expectations. And especially if you don't have an agent, which is more often the case, then if you're like, send it to the Authors Guild, who will probably recommend changes you can't make, or have a literary lawyer look it over, but at least understand what you're agreeing to, regardless of how it's negotiated.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And this is every time I'm like, we want you to read the contract too, so your expectations are correct.
Yes.
Rather than so you don't come back a year later and say, I thought this would happen.
Right. Right. Yep.
Story of our life. All right. Well, if you've been enjoying this episode, keep listening next week because Jane will be back.
It'll be next month, but
next month. Yeah. Or whenever. Keep listening into the future. You'll find stuff you like.
All kinds of episodes.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub.
On Twitter at Microcosm.
On Facebook at Microcosm Publishing.
On Instagram at Microcosm_pub.
And here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.